The story of modern money begins in the most unlikely place imaginable, not in the counting houses of Italian bankers, not in the treasure vaults of Spanish kings, not in the merchant halls of wealthy Venice. It begins in small wooden boats on the cold, gray waters of the North Sea, with men hauling nets full of herring. These Dutch fishermen, working one of the most unglamorous jobs in Europe, accidentally set in motion a chain of events that would create the modern financial system. Banks, stock markets, insurance companies, investment funds, all of these trace their origins back to pickled fish. This is the strange true story of how herring changed the world. To understand how fish could transform global economics, you first need to understand what herring meant to medieval Europe. Before refrigeration, preserving food was one of humanity's greatest challenges. Meat spoiled quickly, vegetables rotted. Grain could be stored but provided limited nutrition. Fish, however, could be salted and preserved for months or even years. And no fish was more important than the herring, which swam in enormous schools through the North Sea and the Baltic. Herring was protein for the masses. It was food for Lent, when the Catholic Church forbade meat. It was provisions for ships and armies. Whoever controlled the herring trade controlled a fundamental necessity of European life. For centuries, that control belonged to the Hanseatic League, a network of German trading cities that dominated commerce around the Baltic Sea. The Hansa, as it was called, had agreements with Scandinavian kingdoms that gave them exclusive access to the best fishing grounds. They salted their herring at shore stations and shipped it throughout Europe. It was a profitable business, but it was limited. The fish had to be processed on land, which meant fishermen could only work close to their home ports. The Hansa grew wealthy, but they never revolutionized anything. The Dutch changed everything with a single innovation. Sometime in the late 14th century, a fisherman named Willem Buckelzoon, or perhaps someone using his methods, developed a new technique for processing herring at sea. The fish were gutted and salted in barrels right on the boat, immediately after being caught. This seems like a small change, but its consequences were enormous. Dutch fishing boats could now stay at sea for weeks at a time, following the herring wherever they went. They were no longer limited to waters close to shore. They could fish anywhere in the North Sea and return with full holds of perfectly preserved catch. The quality of Dutch herring was also superior. Because the fish were processed immediately, before any decay could begin, they tasted better and lasted longer. European consumers quickly learned to prefer Dutch herring over the competition. By the mid-15th century, the Dutch had broken the Hanseatic monopoly. By the 16th century, they dominated the herring trade completely. Hundreds of specialized fishing boats called herring busses worked the North Sea, each carrying crews of 15 to 30 men. The catch was enormous, sometimes exceeding 100 million fish per year. This was industrial-scale fishing 300 years before the Industrial Revolution. The herring trade created something that the Dutch had never had before: surplus capital. The profits from fishing accumulated in the hands of merchants who had more money than they knew what to do with. This was the first link in the chain. Wealth from herring needed somewhere to go. The merchants began looking for other investments, and they found them in the expanding world of global trade. Here the story of fish intersects with the story of empire. By the late 16th century, the Portuguese and Spanish had established trading routes to Asia, bringing back spices that were worth their weight in gold. The Dutch, newly independent from Spanish rule and desperately seeking wealth, wanted access to this trade. In 1595, the first Dutch fleet sailed for Indonesia. The voyage was a disaster, with only a fraction of the crew surviving, but the spices they brought back sold for enormous profits. More expeditions followed. Dutch merchants began forming companies to finance these dangerous but lucrative ventures. The problem was that trading voyages to Asia required far more capital than any single merchant possessed. A fleet of ships, provisions for 2-year voyages, trade goods to exchange, all of this cost fortunes. The solution was to pool resources. Groups of merchants formed temporary partnerships to finance single voyages, dividing both the costs and the profits. This worked, but it was inefficient. Each voyage required new negotiations, new agreements, new partnerships. There had to be a better way. In 1602, the Dutch government authorized the creation of something unprecedented, the Dutch East India Company, known by its Dutch initials as the VOC. This was the world's first true multinational corporation. It had the power to negotiate treaties, wage war, establish colonies, and govern territories. But its greatest innovation was financial. The VOC was a permanent company with permanent capital. Investors could buy shares that entitled them to a portion of all future profits. These shares could be bought and sold freely. For the first time in history, ownership of a business could be traded like any other commodity. The creation of the VOC required a place where shares could be traded. In 1602, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange opened, the first modern stock market in the world. It began as a simple outdoor gathering where VOC shares changed hands. Over time, it evolved into a sophisticated institution with its own building, its own rules, and its own culture. Traders developed techniques that are still used today. They speculated on future prices. They sold shares they didn't own, hoping to buy them back cheaper later. They formed syndicates to manipulate the market. The full range of modern financial behavior emerged in Amsterdam within decades of the exchange's creation. The stock market created new needs and new institutions. Traders needed credit to finance their speculations. This led to the development of modern banking. The Bank of Amsterdam, founded in 1609, was unlike any bank that had existed before. It held deposits, transferred funds between accounts, and provided stable currency in a world of unreliable coinage. It did not lend money recklessly or engage in speculation. It was boring and trustworthy, which was exactly what commerce needed. The Bank of Amsterdam became the foundation of the entire Dutch financial system. Merchants trading with distant lands faced another problem: risk. Ships sank in storms. Pirates captured cargoes. Wars disrupted trade routes. A merchant who invested everything in a single voyage could lose everything if that voyage failed. The solution was insurance. Dutch merchants developed sophisticated systems for spreading risk across multiple parties. For a premium, insurers would compensate merchants for losses at sea. This allowed much greater risk-taking because no single failure could wipe out an investor. The insurance industry that began in Amsterdam would eventually grow to cover every imaginable risk across the global economy. But perhaps the most important innovation was one of mindset. The Dutch developed a new way of thinking about money and investment that had never existed before. In most of Europe, wealth meant land. Noble families measured their status by the estates they controlled. Commerce was considered beneath aristocratic dignity. The Dutch rejected this entirely. In the Netherlands, merchants were the elite. Making money through trade was respected, not scorned. Investment was celebrated as contributing to the common good. This cultural shift was as important as any financial innovation. The results were astonishing. The 17th century became the Dutch Golden Age. A small nation of fewer than 2 million people, occupying land that was partly below sea level and had almost no natural resources, became the wealthiest country in Europe. Amsterdam became the financial capital of the world. Dutch ships carried more cargo than those of all other European nations combined. Dutch banks financed projects across the continent. Dutch investors funded everything from drainage projects in England to mining operations in Sweden. The success created its own problems. Too much money chasing too few investments led to speculation and bubbles. The most famous was tulip mania in 1637, when prices for tulip bulbs rose to absurd heights before crashing spectacularly. A single bulb could cost more than a house at the peak of the mania. When prices collapsed, fortunes were wiped out overnight. Tulip mania is often cited as the first speculative bubble in history, though some historians argue its effects have been exaggerated. Either way, it demonstrated that the new financial system could generate a rational excess as easily as productive investment. The innovations developed in the Netherlands did not stay there. English merchants visited Amsterdam and brought back what they learned. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, was modeled partly on the Bank of Amsterdam. The London Stock Exchange, established in the early 18th century, copied Dutch practices. As Britain rose to become the dominant economic power, it used Dutch financial techniques to fund its expansion. The Americans who later built Wall Street were building on foundations laid in Amsterdam centuries earlier. All of this began with herring. The chain of causation is clear. Superior fishing techniques created surplus capital. Surplus capital funded trading voyages. Trading voyages required new forms of business organization. New business organizations needed stock markets, banks, and insurance companies. Each innovation enabled the next. Without the humble herring, none of it would have happened, at least not in the way it did, not when it did, not where it did. The fishermen who developed better salting techniques had no idea what they were starting. Willem Buckelzoon, if he even existed as a single person, was just trying to catch more fish and keep them fresh. He could not have imagined stock exchanges or multinational corporations or insurance policies. But his innovation, combined with thousands of other small innovations by people whose names are lost to history, created something unprecedented. The Dutch financial revolution transformed how humans organize economic activity. We still live in the world it created. Today, trillions of dollars flow through stock markets every day. Banks in every country hold deposits and make loans. Insurance companies cover risks from car accidents to hurricanes to space launches. Investment funds manage retirement savings for hundreds of millions of people. All of these institutions operate on principles that were developed in Amsterdam 4 centuries ago by merchants looking for ways to profit from the spice trade, using capital they had accumulated from selling pickled fish. The story of Dutch fishermen and modern money is ultimately a story about how small changes can have enormous consequences. No one designed the modern financial system. It emerged from countless individual decisions, each one sensible in its own context, that combined to create something no one had planned. Herring led to capital. Capital led to trade. Trade led to corporations. Corporations led to stock markets. Stock markets led to banks and insurance and the entire infrastructure of modern capitalism. The fishermen pulling nets from the cold North Sea were the unlikely founders of the world we live in now.